This is part 2 of The Spirit Child, Tessa Lamar novels, Book 3. Written by Kathryn M. Hearst. Narrated by Holly Adams. Be sure to subscribe to Kathryn's channel where you can find part 3 of this audiobook, along with more of Kathryn's paranormal and contemporary romance novels.
Chapter 15.
I'm telling you, I feel fine.
Aaron rolled his neck from side to side.
What the hell did she do to me?
I'd asked myself the same question and came up with even more questions. Jolene didn't do anything. I'm pretty sure it was the ghost. Though he'd come to within seconds and appeared no worse for the wear, the sack techs had pulled Jolene from the room in hysterics. Without the ability to communicate verbally with the child, I had no idea if my leaving her or Aaron's collapse had induced her reaction. It had taken some fancy talking and a handful of lies to get Aaron out of the building without a call to 911. Samuel's explanation of hypoglycemia and no lunch came in handy, though for Aaron's sake, we needed to figure out what had caused him to lose consciousness.
Ghost or not, I don't think she likes me.
Aaron cast a worried look in Bryson's direction. I took his hand to keep his attention off whatever concoction Bryson cooked up in the kitchen. Maybe she's afraid of police officers.
I wasn't in uniform.
You're wearing a badge on your belt. Maybe she saw it? The explanation sounded lame, but I needed Aaron on board with fostering Jolene. Aaron gave me a hard look, then called to Bryson.
Come in here and talk to her. I told you I'm fine. Until next time,
Bryson said. I poked Aaron's side. The man made the worst patient. Until we figure out why you're seeing spirits, we can't stop them from hurting you. Bryson returned to the living room with a bowl and a piece of leather cord.
Tessa, I'm going to need your help.
A bitter, sour odor, like rotten olives, wrinkled my nose. I eased from Aaron's side. What is that?
A protection amulet.
Bryson either hadn't noticed or ignored my expression.
I can't wear something that reeks like alcohol sweat. It won't smell when Tessa's finished with it. Take your shirt off.
Bryson glanced between Aaron and me and set his jaw.
Heat the metal when I lift it from the bowl.
Aaron removed his t-shirt. Okay. I didn't like where this was headed. Bryson strung the cord through the opening at the top of what looked like 2 nails twisted together. I drew my magic into my right hand and waited until he lifted the amulet from the poultice. A bolt of energy shot from the nails into my finger and up my arm.
Hurry!
Bryson nodded. Could have warned me, I muttered, and channeled the heat of the firebird into the metal. The end result was a pendant resembling a black Italian horn. Without a word, Bryson pressed the molten metal to Aaron's chest above his sternum. Aaron hissed.
Shit! Could have warned me? And listened to you complain? Lick the burn, Tessa. It'll help with the pain.
Bryson grinned and took the bowl into the kitchen. Aaron called over his shoulder,
I don't need her to kiss it and make it better.
Bryson said from the other room,
It's not an ordinary burn. A little firebird spit will prevent it from scarring.
I didn't relish the thought of putting my tongue on blistered skin, but I trusted Bryson. Moving Aaron's hand, I leaned forward and licked the burn. Aaron's muscles twitched.
Wow,
he whispered against my ear.
I knew you were good with your tongue, but that feels incredible.
Feeling more than a little emboldened, I kissed a line to his right nipple. We had things to discuss, a house to clean, and plans to make, but I had the feeling he'd be more agreeable after I reminded him of how good we were together. Aaron curled his fingers in my hair and sighed a moan.
If you have to take it off, keep it in your pocket,
Bryson said from the kitchen.
Sure thing.
Aaron tightened his grip and urged my head lower. In the months since I'd accepted their marriage proposals, I'd slept with Aaron, and I'd slept with Bryson, but the three of us together hadn't ventured past kissing. Earlier, when I'd suggested we fool around, I'd meant together. All of us. But now the opportunity had arrived, my nerves threatened to derail me.
Tessa's right. This will keep the spirits at bay until we figure it out,
Bryson said, clanking around in the kitchen. He'd started dinner the same time he'd mixed the ingredients for the protection spell.
Thanks.
Aaron's breaths quickened when I popped the buttons on his jeans. I had no idea how this would play out with Bryson, but I certainly didn't want to discuss it and ruin the moment. I'd much rather ask for forgiveness than permission. My heart might have been pounding, but if Aaron were nervous, his body hadn't received the memo. I lowered my head. His fingers tightened in my hair and he sucked in a breath. The thrill of getting caught, along with wicked thoughts of what the two of them could do to my body if working together, had me on the verge of exploding. So much so, I found myself getting creative with my tongue and hands.
Damn, Tessa. Damn.
Aaron's words came out as both a challenge and surrender.
Bryson, turn the stove off. Our girl needs you. Dinner's almost done. So am I.
Aaron's thighs tensed. Bryson's heavy footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor. I didn't stop, nor did I risk a glance in his direction. The butterflies in my stomach felt more like a gull trapped in a can. Seconds ticked by without a word or indication of his reaction. Hands lifted my hips. Fingers tugged the waistband of my yoga pants. A body pressed against mine from behind. My world spun out of orbit, slingshot back, and snapped into place. I'd done it. Crossed some imaginary line and fallen into pure bliss. I came back to reality half-dressed and fully dazed, curled up between them in the middle of a king-sized bed. Interesting difference between my men. Sex made Aaron drowsy, but energized Bryson. His constant touching and whispering managed to pull me back from the brink of sleep.
You awake?
Bryson whispered. Almost. I rolled over to face him.
Tell me again what happened before Jolene threw the books.
I thought back to my conversation with the girl. She asked if Aaron and I were together. I said yes, and she immediately stared off into space. I know she was listening to someone, but I couldn't pick up on the entity. Whoever it is strong. He grew quiet. The perfume is bugging me. It used to be very popular with teen girls. There's something else. The spirit at the death scene? She looked a lot like Jolene.
Did you smell the perfume there?
No, but it was hard to smell anything over the corpse rot. Bryson rolled to his back.
Spirits are your area of expertise. What does your gut tell you?
I rested my head on his chest. I don't know yet. I thought the ghost might have followed me, but I would have picked up on her. If it's even the same spirit. It could be unrelated, but I don't think it is. Aaron mumbled,
Not that I know much, but the incident at the hospital felt the same as at the death scene. Like something grabbed my spine and twisted it into a pretzel.
Did you notice anything about the spirit or her energy? I sat up and pulled the sheet to my chest.
It was pissed.
He rubbed his belly.
I'm starving. Can we finish this conversation over dinner? Sounds good.
Bryson's stomach growled at the mention of food. One thing for sure, we can't leave Jolene alone with the ladies until she learns to control her gift.
More like a curse.
Aaron's laughter sounded as bitter as the poultice we'd used to create his amulet. Chapter 16. Jolene Park sat at Graham May's kitchen table working on her third helping of meatloaf and mashed potatoes. I had no idea a young girl could pack away as much as a grown man. Even Bryson, at 230 pounds of solid muscle, had bowed out after his second plate. I leaned close and whispered, "Save some room for dessert. Graham May made my favorite, strawberry cake with vanilla icing." She nodded without glancing up from her food. "My stars, we're going to need more groceries." Graham May had fussed over the girl since the social worker had dropped her off an hour earlier. "When you're finished, I'll show you my garden. The tomatoes are about ready for picking. I could use some help." Jolene swallowed half a glass of milk, wiped her mouth, and nodded. Dottie watched the interaction from the sink. As with most things, she appeared content to let Graham May take the lead with the girl. "It was my job to pick the tomatoes when I was your age." I motioned to her empty plate. "Are you finished?" Jolene patted her belly and grinned.
"I'll take care of the dishes while you ladies get her settled."
Bryson stood and reached across the table. The girl's eyes widened and she shrank back. It didn't take a license in mental health therapy to figure out a man had abused her. Bryson eased his hand back and sat across from the girl.
"I didn't mean to scare you."
She glanced at Graham May, then me, and finally back to him.
"I have an idea. You let me know if it's a good one, okay?"
He kept his voice low and his posture open. Jolene eyed him while she chewed her lip. After what felt like an hour, she nodded.
"If I crowd or I scare you, I want you to make the peace sign. Like this."
He extended his index and middle fingers.
"When I see it, I'll know that I need to give you some space. How does that sound?"
She gave him a dubious look, but nodded. He gave her his single dimple grin, the one that told me he was holding back his emotions.
"Show me the sign."
Jolene held 2 fingers up.
"Good. It won't hurt my feelings if you use it. Everyone needs space sometimes. Right, Tessa?"
I laughed. "Right. Can I use the sign when you get on my nerves?" He cast me a sideways glance.
"Nope. You can use your words."
"We all know what kind of words Tessa Marie uses when you boys get under her skin." Graham May leaned close to Jolene and whispered, "The kind that gets her mouth washed out with soap." I held my breath, hoping my dear sweet great-grandmother hadn't scared the child. Jolene's laughter filled the kitchen and warmed me from the bottoms of my feet to the hair on my head. Graham May untied her apron. "Now, would you rather see the rest of the house or the tomatoes?" The girl stood and crossed her legs, the universal sign for needing a potty break. "I'll take her." I motioned for Jolene to follow me into my old bedroom, which happened to contain the only bathroom in the house. Her big blue eyes widened at the pink-ruffled curtains and quilt on the twin-sized bed. "The bathroom is through this door." I opened it and stepped aside to give her plenty of space to pass. She motioned to the room, then pointed to herself. "Yep, this is one of your bedrooms. But you should know, Graham May gets up to pee a couple of times during the night, and she has to come through here to do it." Jolene giggled and hurried into the bathroom. I stood guard at the door as she did her business and washed her hands. Her mama had raised her right. She peeked out and motioned to the candy dish of rose-shaped soaps on the counter. "Oh, yes, those are special." I picked one up and brought it to my nose. Images of my birth mother visiting me in the rose-scented mist flashed through my mind. They're charmed with a protection spell. When I was little, they helped me keep all but one spirit away. Jolene furrowed her brow. "The woman you drew in your picture. Her name is Achila." I handed her the soap. "You can use these. They might help you." Jolene stared at it for a long moment, then stuffed it in her pocket. She tilted her head and mimed writing. I motioned to the desk where I'd done my homework and wrote in my journal. "There's plenty of pens and paper, and Bryson bought you a little spiral notebook and pencil to keep in your pocket." She motioned to the door, then to me, and hugged herself. The same gesture she'd used to ask about Aaron and me. I hesitated answering, not wanting a repeat appearance of the angry spirit. Jolene dipped her chin and went to the desk where she wrote, "I'm sorry." I sat on the edge of her bed. "It's okay. It was the ghost, wasn't it?" The girl frowned and wrote, "Can't say." "I understand, but I'm here if you want to talk." I wanted to ask why she couldn't say, who had told her to keep quiet and why. I wanted to explain that secrets weren't healthy in families, but mostly I wanted to rid the child of the malevolent spirit that haunted her. "Bryson is my other boyfriend." Jolene grinned and raised 2 fingers. "Are you making the peace sign?" I knew she wasn't, but I couldn't help myself. She shook her head, nice and slow. "Yes, 2. Part of me was glad she couldn't tell social services they'd placed her in a home with a woman who had 2 boyfriends, or worse, telling Darlene she wasn't my mother. She scribbled, "I have 2 rooms?" "Yep. Would you like to see the other one?" She nodded. I led her into the kitchen. "Grandma, we'll meet you outside. Jojo wants to see her other digs." My great-grandmother pulled 2 sets of gardening gloves from the shelf. "Don't be long. I need those tomatoes for tonight's supper." Jolene crossed her heart and took my hand. Bryson and Dottie exchanged a knowing look, but I smiled it away. Let them think what they wanted. It was probably true after all, but I wasn't ready to admit out loud that Aiden Scott and Jolene had set the alarm on my biological clock. As we walked the path between May's and Charlie's houses, I whistled the tune my grandfather had whistled while working in the garden. Jojo pointed to the oak with clear and blue bottles hanging from its branches. "That's Grandma's bottle tree. It's an old Southern tradition, brought here by the enslaved people, but it goes back for as long as people made glass. The blue bottles trap evil spirits, and the clear ones attract good ones. Some folks say the spirits die when the sun rises, but you and I know that isn't true." Her grip tightened around my fingers. She opened her mouth as if she would speak, but sighed and dipped her chin. "It's an old superstition. I don't believe the bottles do anything more than look pretty and make a racket on windy days." She nodded. "Watch where you're walking around the flower beds. We have snakes on the property. They don't bite, but it's best if you don't step on them." Her face brightened and she pointed at my front window. Bryson's chocolate Labrador retriever stared out from her perch on the couch. "That's Maddie. Want to meet her?" Jolene nodded so quickly I thought she might give herself whiplash. I stopped outside the door. Lucky for us, Bryson trained her to obey silent commands. If you want her to sit, hold your arm out and make a fist. If you want her to lay down, hold your hand flat. Jolene mimicked the hand signals and edged behind my legs when I reached for the knob. I couldn't blame her. The dog weighed more than she did. Maddie bounded out and knocked the girl flat on her backside. To make matters worse, she licked Jolene's face until it glistened with dog spit. "Maddie, sit!" I held up my fist, but whoever thought of teaching a dog sign language failed to notice that dogs never looked at you when you wanted them to. "Maddie, no!" Jolene giggled and squirmed beneath 80 pounds of brown fur and wet tongue. Once satisfied she'd christened the girl, and not a second sooner, Maddie sat. Gross. Let's get you cleaned up. I hoisted the soggy child from the front porch. Still laughing, Jolene wiped her face and followed me inside. She took in the living room, especially the family photographs. Her gaze lingered on a picture of Aaron, Bryson, and me. That one was taken at our first cookout. It's one of my favorites. I pointed to another. That's me and my grandfather when I was 4. This was his and Dottie's house. Jolene stared at the photo, then turned and motioned toward Charlie's favorite recliner. I shook my head, refusing to contemplate that she could see the one spirit I'd give my right arm to speak to. The girl pointed to the photo, the chair, and to me. But when she thumped her nose, my knees threatened to give out. Charlie didn't kiss cheeks. He kissed or thumped noses. Chapter 17. I'd promised myself I wouldn't leave Jolene alone with Dottie and Grandma until she had a handle on her gift, or Bryson and I figured out how to get rid of the nasty spirit following the girl. I told myself I wouldn't go too far, and I'd hear any commotion in the yard. Lately, I'd become a pro at rationalizing broken promises. I handed JoJo off to Grandma in the garden. My great-grandmother had launched into her tomato-picking lecture before I'd even turned around. Fine by me. I needed a few minutes alone and a good cry, or maybe to kick something. I'd decide when the moment struck. Bryson stood in the kitchen window when I returned to the house. He stared out at God knew what, with his brows drawn together and a hard set to his jaw. He must have seen me coming up the path, but he hadn't bothered to acknowledge my presence. Perfect. I spun on my heel and marched toward the back door. I needed to spend some time in the sky before I lost my temper or burst into tears, or both.
Someone abused her.
Bryson's words stopped me. I know. It's not surprising. Her file is full of police reports for domestic violence calls to the trailer. Her stepfather was a real piece of work.
You said you encountered his spirit the night Erin took you to her home?
He continued to stare out the window. Yes?
Could he be the one harassing her?
Not unless he likes little girl perfume. As soon as the words fell out of my mouth, my stomach tried to expel my lunch.
We need to have a chat with her stepfather.
His tone made my already revolting tummy clench. I think I'm going to be sick. He turned and looked at me for the first time since I walked into the house. I'd seen Bryson pissed, but never like this. His expression promised blood and pain and death. If one could kill someone who'd already passed away. My nausea gave way to an overwhelming need to comfort the murderous thoughts from his mind. Haley's a terrific therapist. She would have picked up on it if the girl had been sexually abused.
Maybe. But you're not going to convince me she wasn't physically abused. You saw the way she reacted to me.
We can summon Benjamin Wagner, have a conversation, see if he's the one troubling her. But the bottom line is, we need to put our energy into helping her recover from her trauma, regardless of the cause. Exhausted, I leaned against the door jamb. Bryson tilted his head.
What else is wrong?
I closed my eyes. I sucked at lying to the people I loved. They always saw right through me. Yet, the possibility that Jolene had suffered more than we knew made my problem seem insignificant. I think she saw Charlie earlier. He cringed. Yeah. I mean, why can she see him and I can't? He speaks to Dottie now and then, but can't be bothered to talk to me. After he died without telling me the truth about Achila and what I am. The words spilled out, along with an anger that I hadn't realized I'd carried since the day he left me.
Come here.
Bryson's voice had softened, but a hint of gravel remained. He held his arm out, inviting me to curl into his chest. I closed the distance and he wrapped me in his arms. My safe place, where the world fell away and nothing mattered except us.
I know it hurts. Charlie will come to you when he's ready. For now, know he's watching over you.
Bryson whispered into my hair. I don't understand what he's waiting for. I've been shot twice and blown up. I figured out the Firebird and him learning more magic every day. What's he waiting for? I pulled back enough to meet his gaze.
That's a question I cannot answer.
Bryson kissed the tip of my nose, the way Charlie had done for as long as I could remember. I hiccuped a sob.
Babe, let's fly. It's been a few days. Shedding our skin will do us both some good.
What about Jolene? We shouldn't leave her alone with Grandma and Dottie.
We'll stay close enough to keep a visual on the yard.
Okay. I followed Bryson to the back of the house. He'd designed the new addition with a mudroom that would allow us the privacy to shift, a place to leave our clothes, and the ability to lock up. 3 things, along with a huge master bathroom that made my heart go pitter-patter. Bryson and I stripped side by side. He took my hand, and we stepped bare as the day we were born into the backyard. Early on, changing into my spirit animal took trial and error, but lately it came to me like second nature. One moment I was human, the next I stretched my wings and soared through the sky. I no longer thought of the Firebird as a separate entity any more than I thought of my foot as independent from my body. The primal nature of my spirit animal was as much me as the intellectual part, or the part that loved to aggravate Darlene. I blinked several times to adjust to the changes in my vision. Rather than the limited periphery of a human, I could see almost a full 360 degrees. My sight sharpened, and the 7 colors of the rainbow multiplied into shades I could no more name than describe. Bryson's hawk flew above me, as majestic and proud as his human self. Another difference between wearing human skin and feathers was the overwhelming knowledge that we were mates. No questions, no doubts, no fear. We were 2 halves of a whole, or better yet, 2/3 of a whole, with Aaron filling the gap. Mice, snakes, and other small creatures scurried from my shadow as I circled the property. Grandma shielded her eyes and looked to the sky from her garden. Jolene set a basket of tomatoes to the side and watched as Bryson and I glided heavenward on a warm updraft. The hawk called to me, and the Firebird answered. He dove and locked his talons with mine. Hooked together, we spiraled head first toward the ground. The mating dance involved complete trust. If one of us failed to break free, we'd both hit the ground. Bryson released me and climbed again. Over and over we rose and fell in the late afternoon sky, commanding and yielding, soaring and falling, loving and letting go. If only life in human skin were so simple. Chapter 18. The air conditioning blasting into the evidence room didn't stand a chance against the heat radiating from my skin. My magic ran hot or cold. Today, it was scorching. I sat back and wiped the sweat from my forehead. I'd spent the previous 3 hours sorting through the evidence collected at the murder scene. Without reflective surfaces or the dead to speak to, my efforts had produced a whole lot of nothing other than a massive headache. Aaron came through the door with 2 bottles of water dangling from one hand and an evidence bag in the other.
Hey, beautiful. I come bearing gifts.
I pushed my chair from the table and stood to stretch. Thanks.
How's it going?
He motioned to the pile of evidence.
Any luck?
No, and we really need to have an in-service training on labeling these damned envelopes. It'd be great if there was a checkbox for shiny things, but since that's not going to happen, people could at least fill in the description section of the log. I snatched a bottle from him. Aaron took a step back, likely to put himself at a safe distance from my crazy.
I'll mention it to the chief.
I sucked down half the water and plopped into my chair. Sorry. It's beyond frustrating. It's been 3 weeks and we have squat.
Not true. We have an ID on the latest victim and the first name of another. Once we have the reports back, we'll know how long the other girls were dead and possibly DNA matches. These are cold cases, less of a priority.
They aren't less of a priority to their families.
You know what I mean.
He pulled his shirt from his chest several times.
It's 20 degrees warmer in here than the hall.
I gave him a less than patient look. He'd spent enough time with me to know I ran hot. I didn't need reminding.
Something else bothering you?
The tone of his voice rose enough to let me know he'd asked, but might not want an actual answer.
How's the kid?
She's fine. Settling in fine. Everything's fine. I motioned to the evidence bag in his hand. Is that for me? He nodded slowly, as if afraid any sudden movements would send me into a fit.
You don't sound fine.
I folded my arms. It's stupid. Jolene told me she saw Charlie in the house.
You don't believe her?
No, that's not it. I brought my hand to my mouth to chew my thumbnail, but lowered it when I remembered I wore latex gloves. He's reached out to Dottie and Jolene, but I haven't heard a peep from him. God knows I could have used his help over the last few months. Aaron took a seat across from me.
That sucks.
Right? I grinned despite my foul mood. That he'd understood my frustration without launching into a bunch of crap about he'd talk to me when he was ready meant the world to me. Between that, my empty stomach, and the heat, I'm grouchy.
Maybe this will cheer you up.
He slid the bag across the table.
A gift from Samuel's. Thought you might need it.
What is it? I snapped off the gloves I'd worn to handle bloody clothing.
A locket from one of the girls.
He relaxed into the chair, arms folded, long legs outstretched. I broke the seal and emptied the contents of the envelope into my palm. The delicate gold locket had a cross engraved on the front and a date on the back, but nothing on the inside. No tiny picture, no name, no hint as to the identity of its owner. Did it come off the recent victim? Aaron shook his head. Dang. I'd have more luck connecting to the spirit of the newly departed. I closed my eyes and drew my magic to my hand. Heat flared in my gut and the firebirds stirred. Inside me, she called to her mate. Aaron met my eyes with an expression that made me feel a different kind of heat. Don't look at me like that. You're distracting me.
Sorry. I can't help it when you do that.
He dipped his chin and glanced away. Visions flashed through my mind, but the images were blurry and the shapes distorted. Glass or silver gave the best impressions. Darker metals couldn't reflect pure images. However, gold tended to retain more energy than most any other element. Amy. The name came through loud and clear, though I wasn't entirely sure if it originated from the vision or a spirit had whispered it to me. This belonged to Amy? I stilled my magic and waited for a reply. When none came, I refocused on the locket. A heartbeat thudded in my ears along with my own. I had the sense of time passing. Fear turned to terror and turned to agony. The girl had suffered. Aaron placed his hand over mine. His energy eased the panic welling inside enough to allow me to focus. Amy. An entirely different emotion leaped from the locket. Love. Softness, coupled with excitement. A woman had given the girl the jewelry as a gift. I knew nothing of the girl who owned the locket, or the person who'd given it to her, but I didn't need to know their demographics. I'd felt their emotions. I knew them more intimately than most. Her name is Amy. The necklace was a gift. My voice trembled.
Tessa?
Aaron moved to my side, took my face in his hands, and brushed his thumbs over my cheeks.
Are you all right?
I could have pulled myself together. Sure, I'd shed a couple of tears, but I was a professional. I could have zipped up my feelings. But the moment he touched me, I shattered inside, and the remnants of my heart liquefied and seeped out my eyes.
Honey.
He pulled me against his chest.
It'll be okay. We'll get her home and find the monster who did this to her.
I had no doubt he'd make good on his promise. Aaron was a Boy Scout in that regard. Samuels poked his head into the room.
Phone call, Lamar.
Aaron and I jumped apart like a couple of teens caught necking on the couch.
Everything okay in here?
Samuel sounded like he had to swallow his grin to speak.
Need a minute? Mood music? Condom?
Aaron crossed his arms.
Vic's name is Amy. Do we have any idea how long she was in the ground?
I risked a glance at Samuels. The man may have enjoyed teasing us, but his expression surprised me. The lines at the corners of his eyes had deepened, and his jaw had softened. It was as close to sympathy as I could hope for at the station.
Not yet. Should be any day now. I'll run through missing persons for the last 10 years for an Amy.
He handed me his cell.
Your Aunt Dottie. She says it's urgent.
I stared at the phone, confused. Dottie had called Samuels? He chuckled.
You gonna answer it, or shall I play secretary and take a message?
I narrowed my eyes and snatched the phone from his hand. Hello? Hi, Tessa. Sorry to bother you at work, but it's Jolene. My fingers tightened. The social worker called and, well, we have to get her in school on Monday or they might remove her. My pulse pounded, making it impossible to hear her. Family meeting. Dottie paused. 2 weeks had passed since Jolene had come to stay with us. I knew we'd have to send her to school sooner or later, but I'd hoped it would be later. Much later. She had yet to speak. What sort of hell would the other kids unleash on her? Surely at least one of them had seen the news. Kids were cruel about things like glasses and braces. They'd be downright ugly about admitting to murdering your stepfather, even if she didn't do it. I met Aaron's gaze and frowned. I'll be home soon. Call the school and set up a meeting with the guidance counselor or principal. They'll need to know she's coming back. Chapter 19. Grandma, Dottie, Aaron, and I sat around a calendar the size of my kitchen table while Jolene and Maddie supervised the goings-on from across the room. The official goings-on hadn't started yet because Bryson was still in the office with Mr. Suarez and his bursitis. Why don't we get started and catch him up when he's finished? I honestly had no idea why it took 5 adults to plan the schedule for one little girl, but Dottie had insisted we wait. Boy, did we wait. Almost an hour had passed since the tribal member and his enormous elbow had shown up unannounced. Because we'll need Bryson to help with the driving. The tone of Grandma's voice left no room for argument. We'd sit in the kitchen until time for Sunday service at this rate. Male voices carried from the living room, and the front door closed. About dang time. I still hadn't gotten over reading Amy's necklace, or my grandfather choosing to speak to everyone in the county except me. Plus, I hated the idea of sending Jolene to school. Tessa Marie, what's gotten into you? Grandma shook her head.
Sorry about that.
Bryson slid into the chair next to mine.
What have you decided?
Absolutely nothing. I flashed him a saccharine sweet smile. We were waiting for you. He squeezed my thigh under the table, basically using his touch to tell me we'd discuss it later. Bryson smiled at the girl.
Hey, Jojo. Do you want to sit at the table with us? We might have some questions.
She shook her head and hugged Maddie. The dog returned the affection with a big, slobbery kiss. Jolene had started to warm up to Bryson. In the previous 2 weeks, she'd used the peace sign 3 times. Once to test it out, and twice when her anxiety spiked. Aaron was an entirely different matter. The girl watched him as if he were a snake coiled and ready to strike. Until the family meeting, she'd done her best to avoid him. Aaron pointed to the calendar.
School lets out an hour early on Wednesdays.
Oh, I forgot about that. Dottie erased the error. Grandma shifted her dentures. That gives us more time to get homework done, dinner, and make it to church by 6. Jolene moved her jaw from side to side, as if trying to figure out how the woman had moved her mouth in such an odd manner.
She is tap class on Wednesdays at 5. I think we'll have to stick to church on Sundays.
Aaron winked. The man had yet to attend a Wednesday night service. Dottie flipped through the dance schedule. She can do tap on Tuesdays and Thursdays and ballet on Mondays and Wednesdays at 4 o'clock. Grandma nudged Aaron. See, the good Lord provides a way. I gawked at the calendar. That's 4 days of dance classes, a weekly appointment with her pageant coach, plus she has therapy with Dr. Alexander at least twice a month. My eyes had gone buggy with all the pieces and parts necessary to make a little girl into a pageant queen. How Jolene's mother had pulled it off with a limited income mystified me. But the girl had won the right to compete at the state level and had a hefty scholarship account waiting for her when she graduated high school. Continuing with pageants provided continuity between her previous life and her new one. Besides, if it made her happy, we'd make it work. Bryson glanced at the girl, then pointed to a section of the Junior Miss Whatever application. The bolded word jumped off the page and hit me between the eyes. Interview. Oh no. I snatched the paper and read the requirements. Contestants were expected to answer questions from the judges while on stage. I handed Dottie the packet. She adjusted her glasses and lengthened her arm. Any hope of continuing Jolene's dream of winning Miss USA one day was hanging in the balance, and she said, I drew a breath to calm myself. I seriously need to get a grip. Bryson squeezed my thigh again. Evidently, he thought I needed to get a grip too. Dottie turned to the child. Did the judges interview the girls in your previous pageants? Jolene nodded. I knew the moment it occurred to her that she'd have to speak in the competition. Her face fell and her shoulders slumped, but her sideways stare at the cupboard troubled me more. Maddie leapt to her feet and barked at the same seemingly empty space. Bryson's deep voice cut through the racket.
Maddie, down.
The girl folded in on herself like a wilted flower. She covered her ears and rocked back and forth. The dog continued to bark until Jolene raised her head and glared. Poor Maddie yelped and dove under Grandma's chair for safety. The baby powder smell filled the air and clung to the back of my throat. Uh-oh, I whispered, pinching Bryson's arm to get his attention. Aaron, God bless him, caught on quick and stood, placing himself between my great-grandmother and the child. Jolene, or whoever had control of her body, pushed to her feet and placed her hands on her hips. "Grandma, Dottie, you ladies go out the back door," I whispered. The girl whipped her head in my direction and gave me a look that caused the hair on the back of my neck to rise. That much contempt didn't belong on such a sweet face. I'd warned the ladies Jolene's behavior could turn ugly in an instant, but I'd left out the part of a mean-spirited ghost. Grandma opened her mouth like she intended to argue, but took one look at Aaron, Bryson, and I, and snapped it closed. Her and Dottie skedaddled out of the kitchen into the back door, with Aaron providing cover. The girl smirked and made a tisking sound. Her full attention on Aaron, she narrowed her eyes.
Jolene, you need to fight this and come back to us.
Bryson eased from behind the table. Aaron widened his stance and his arms. He reminded me of an old-fashioned gunslinger preparing to draw. Maddie's high-pitched whine from under the table grated my nerves. I'd had enough. Oh, for the love of Pete. Bryson, take my hand. Let's do the you-know-what, like we did with Gavin and the others. He looked at me as if I'd lost my mind. Did I really have to say banishing spell out loud? Somehow I didn't think the ghost would approve. You know, like with Gavin? He reached across the table and took my hand. Before we could utter the first syllable, Jolene spun around, grabbed a fork, and sank it into the meaty part of Aaron's thigh. That's when all hell broke loose. Aaron groaned, Maddie howled, Bryson dove for the girl, and she screamed obscenities that would send Grandma into cardiac arrest. I stood there, caught between the what the hell do I do and holy cow, she spoke.
Say the words, Tessa.
Bryson struggled to get control of the flailing child. He had her back to his chest, her wrist in one hand and his arm around her middle. Her feet dangling above the ground, Jolene kicked and screamed. I couldn't be sure, but she seemed stronger than any 9-year-old I'd ever met. I placed one hand on Bryson's neck and took Aaron's with the other. Someone has to move. You have to go. You will go in the dark. You will hide in the day. I send you away, back to where you were. Through paths not walked, with eyes not seeing, I send you away. As it is said, it will be done. Jolene's potty mouth morphed from words to screams. Bryson joined me the second time I recited the incantation. By the third time, Aaron had joined in. However, the sickly sweet smell of perfume remained in the air. I released Aaron's hand. Why isn't it working?
I don't know.
Bryson's grip tightened on the girl. I moved in front of her. Who are you? Ask him. She nodded toward Aaron. He knows me.
No clue.
Aaron looked as stunned as I felt. She renewed her efforts to break free of Bryson's grasp. I wagered a guess. Are you Jolene's stepdad? Benjamin Wagner? The girl stopped squirming and turned her nasty stare on Aaron. Fuck no. Gross. I took care of him. He won't hurt JoJo anymore, and neither will anyone else. Why in the world would the spirit think Aaron would hurt Jolene? Had she not witnessed the 5 of us planning our lives around the girl's schedule?
We're trying to help her.
Aaron sounded sure of himself, but the tension in the corners of his eyes gave him away. The situation freaked him out, and that made 2 of us. She glared. You can help her by leaving her alone. I won't let you hurt her." The proverbial light bulb went on over my head. "But you're hurting her now." She stilled for a split second, and I knew I had her. I lowered my voice, hoping to calm her down. "You hurt her when you act out in her body, like when you stabbed that boy and Aaron. Folks don't know the difference. They think it's her." "I was protecting her." She shook her head. "Who's protecting you?" "I don't need protection. I'm already dead. And don't tell me about heaven again. You lie, just like the cop lied. And the man in the blue car lied." The spirit child's voice cracked, and Jolene's body went slack. "She's gone." I sighed. "Jolene, baby, can you hear me?" She nodded and closed her eyes. Bryson lifted the child into his arms.
She needs to sleep it off.
Aaron sank into a chair and frowned at the blood on his jeans.
I support your decision to help her, but I swear, if she starts spewing pea soup, I'm out of here.
Chapter 20. I pulled the pretty pink rosebud quilt over the child and pressed a kiss to her forehead. I had no idea how or why the spirit child had possessed Jolene, but until we found a way to get rid of it, the girl had no hope of a normal life. Bryson leaned against the door jamb with his arms folded.
We can't send her to school.
Or dance class, or any of the other million places she needs to go. I stepped into his personal space, and he wrapped his arms around me. It's not a good idea to leave her with the ladies, either.
I agree.
He pressed his lips to my temple.
She needs to rest.
Bryson and I returned to the kitchen to find Aaron sitting with his head in his hands. "Are you okay? Let me see your thigh." I knelt beside him.
I know who she is. I know the girl haunting Jolene.
Aaron avoided my gaze. Part of me wanted to grill him for answers. I'd encountered my fair share of ghosts, but never one with such a hold on a living human being. I couldn't imagine what had happened in the spirit's life that would cause a child to harbor such hatred. Then again, I didn't want to let my mind wander too far down that path. "We'll talk, but first, drop your pants. I need to clean your wound." I tried for a smile, but I'm quite sure I looked more like a maniac. Aaron stood and lowered his jeans. It's a good thing I was kneeling, because my stomach fell and my knees quivered. The puncture wounds were larger than expected. I'd seen the fork go in, but had missed the part where she'd twisted it. Bryson retrieved 2 small containers from the fridge and a clean dish towel.
Early on, before I became a detective, I responded to a suspected domestic violence call. The neighbors reported screaming.
Aaron's voice quivered. I nodded and soaked the corner of the rag in a vinegar and salt mixture. "This is going to sting." If he heard me, he gave no indication.
The guy consented to a search. He seemed surprised we were there, but otherwise appeared normal.
I dabbed his wounds without risking a glance at his face. I couldn't take the pain in his voice, let alone the haunted look in his eyes.
We didn't find anything.
Aaron hissed when I applied my special blend of honey, garlic, and turmeric to his thigh.
A week later, the same neighbor reported a suspicious smell coming from the house.
Bryson made a sound in the back of his throat.
Damn.
Aaron shifted his weight.
We found the body of a 15-year-old girl, Christina Hayes. She lived 10 miles away. She'd been missing 2 weeks.
I didn't trust myself to speak. Instead, I took his hand and waited for him to finish the story.
The media got wind of it. Christina's parents came to the scene as the ME wheeled the victim out. I'll never forget the sound her mother made. She couldn't see anything. The girl was in a body bag. But she knew. He met my gaze. She knew it was her daughter. Oh, Aaron. I stood and drew him into an embrace. You can't blame yourself. I didn't search the garage, he whispered. It was the end of my shift. I was sure it was a false alarm. I rushed it, and she died. A few months later, her mother passed from cardiac arrest. I held him as he broke. Unsure of what to say to alleviate his guilt, I murmured platitudes because I had no other words. Bryson set his hand on Aaron's shoulder. You made a mistake, learned from it, and became one hell of a homicide detective. What does Christina Hayes have to do with Jolene? I'd meant to keep the thought to myself, but it bounced around inside my skull with enough force that it fell out of my mouth. Aaron stiffened. No clue. Bryson gave me an odd look, something between irritation and relief I'd changed the subject. You put garlic on my thigh? Aaron scraped a bit of the salve from his skin and sniffed the concoction. It has antibiotic properties. You can wash it off in a few minutes, then cover the wound with gauze. I stood and busied myself with tidying up the kitchen. Did you identify the perp? Bryson sank into a chair. No. The owners of the house were out of the country. They had no idea the guy was living there. His plates were stolen. No prints on record. No DNA match. A couple of the neighbors worked with sketch artists, and the drawings were all over the news. We had thousands of tips, but nothing ever came of them. Aaron stared at his hands. What about the recent murder? The spirit, Christina, was at the scene. I ran through everything the dead girl had told me at the crime scene and in the kitchen. Other than a physical resemblance, I found no obvious connection to Jolene. Except Benjamin Wagner, the stepfather. Aaron drummed his fingers. You think he's the connection between Jolene and the murders? I shrugged. Could be. Bryson glanced between us. Rather than guessing, we should ask Christina. Right, because she's been so cooperative up until now. I tucked the dirty dish towel into the laundry room and found Jolene standing in the hall eavesdropping on our conversation. The girl stared, but unlike before, she looked more frightened than pissed off. Jolene was in control, at least for the moment. Hi there. Are you feeling better? I knelt to put myself at her level. She nodded and motioned toward the kitchen. You're welcome to join us. Jolene shook her head and pointed to her thigh. Aaron's okay. I took her hands in mine. You didn't hurt him. We know about Christina. The girl's eyes widened and she took a step back. Her reaction confused me. Are you afraid of her? Jolene shook her head and pressed her hands to her heart. You love her? She nodded. Great. Just great. We needed to send the ghost on her merry way, a difficult task under the best of circumstances, and impossible if Jolene fought to keep her here. We want to help her. Will you come into the kitchen and talk to us? The girl took my hand with both of hers and hung close. We have company, I said, hoping Aaron got the hint and pulled his pants up. Coast is clear, Bryson called from the other room. I led her to the table and motioned for her to sit on the opposite side as Aaron. Bryson's face softened. Are you feeling better? She shrugged. Aaron glanced from me to the girl.
He opened his mouth and closed it. For once, the detective was at a loss for words. Hoping to ease the girl's tension, I seated myself beside her and slung my arm around her shoulders. "Can Christina hear us now?" She nodded. Bryson shot me a warning look. None of us wanted to provoke the spirit, but I needed some answers. "I don't smell her perfume." Jolene made her hands into the shape of claws and nodded, then folded her hands and shook her head. While I'd learned to interpret her unique sign language, in moments like these I would have given anything for a few words. Bryson said,
"It only smells when she's angry?"
The girl nodded. Aaron cleared his throat.
"Can I talk to her?"
Jolene eyed him and looked at me as if asking for approval. "Go ahead." I braced myself for an encore appearance from the ghost. Aaron turned his face toward the ceiling.
"I'm sorry. I should have protected you, and I failed. I'm going to find the man who hurt you and those other girls. I won't let you down again."
My heart broke along with his voice. The perfume smell returned, though much lighter than before. The adults in the room tensed and waited for the attack. Chapter 21. I hated mornings. I especially hated mornings after tossing and turning and nightmares and sleeping alone. As far as crappy mornings went, this morning was the trifecta, and I'd brought it on myself. After settling Jolene back into bed, Bryson, Aaron, and I spent a solid 4 hours planning her schedule, arguing over the medicine shop, and coming up with a plan to rid Jolene of Christina Hayes' spirit once and for all. I'd crawled out from between my men as soon as they'd fallen asleep and parked my fanny in Charlie's chair. Determined to pester him until he appeared, or at least spoke to me, I'd whispered spells and begged and cried. Nothing worked. Once I thought I'd heard him whistling, but it turned out to be the wind blowing through the old jalousie windows. Bryson walked into the living room, fully dressed and wide awake. He took one look at me, and his morning person greeting, the bright new day smile, slipped. I slept here. Technically, I'd sat here crying or cursing, but he didn't need to know that. He slid his hands into his back pockets.
"Are you upset about me continuing to work with the tribe?"
I closed my eyes and drew a breath. Like I said last night, if you want to reopen the medicine shop, do it. But set hours and stick to them. I'm tired of people showing up here all hours of the day and night.
"People work. Some don't trust medical doctors. We're their only source of health care, not to mention the counseling and spell work we do."
So set the hours from 1 to 7. I waved my hand. You know what? It's too early to do this again. We said the exact same things last night.
"You're right. I do need to set hours, but I can't turn away emergencies. You saw Mr. Suarez's elbow. Had I not drained it—"
Yuck! Stop! Please. I pushed myself out of the chair and struggled to stand. At some point during the night, my backside had gone numb. My muscles protested when I walked toward the kitchen.
"What's that on your thigh?"
Bryson brushed the back of my PJ pants.
"Salt?"
I ignored him. Knowing how would I explain that I'd cast a circle around Charlie's chair to trap his spirit and force him to talk to me?
"And I smell sweetgrass."
Bryson ran his hand through his hair and tugged. He tended to do that when he was frustrated.
"Tess, you didn't." "Didn't what?"
Aaron shambled out of the bedroom, scratching his man bits with one hand and his head with the other. I set my hands on the kitchen counter and hung my head. I just wanted to talk to him. Whew, Aaron yawned.
Charlie. She tried to attract his spirit and bind him in a circle.
Bryson turned his attention to me.
Do I have it right?
I wasn't planning on keeping him there for long.
I need caffeine before this gets any weirder.
Aaron, bless his heart, picked up the empty coffee pot and stared at it as if he didn't understand where the liquid had gone. You have a coffee pot at your place. You know how they work. I would have laughed, or at least cracked a smile. But Bryson was watching me with his disappointed and disapproving eyes.
Yeah.
Aaron grabbed the coffee can.
Someone woke up on the wrong side of the bed? Chair.
Bryson folded his arms.
She slept in the chair.
Now Aaron wore the same expression as Bryson.
We're supposed to work the CHRISTINA problem this morning.
So? I'd had about all of the two of them I could handle without carbs and caffeine.
Sleeping with our mate charges and centers us.
Bryson took pity on the detective and took over at the coffee pot. Crap. I hadn't thought about that. Then again, I hadn't planned on being up all night waiting for my grandfather to grace me with his presence. We can still do it. Just let me and Aaron wake up first. I caught sight of a little blonde head ducking back into the hallway. Good morning, Jolene. The guys followed my gaze, but neither spoke. The little girl's presence had ended the conversation, which suited me just fine. She waved. Bryson said,
Would you like blueberry pancakes again?
The girl nodded.
They're my favorite, but no syrup, only butter.
Aaron pressed a hand to his stomach.
That's how Jojo eats them, too.
Bryson chuckled.
You two are strange. Everyone knows you have to drown your pancakes in...
The smell of Love's Baby Soft made my nose twitch. I set my hand on his arm. Jolene, go and sit in the recliner while Bryson makes your breakfast. She pantomimed, brushing her teeth. Go sit in the chair right now. I'd tried to keep the concern out of my voice. Instead, my words came out gruffer than I intended. The sweet fragrance cloyed in my nostrils. Jolene looked from me to Bryson. When he nodded toward the chair, her chin quivered. I inched closer to the girl. I knew the second Christina had taken control. Jolene hadn't stared off or stiffened up. It happened like the spirit had flipped a switch. I'd used a fair amount of magic the previous evening. Some of it still lingered inside me and in the room. Using the extra to my advantage, I moved quicker than I'd ever moved in my human form and grabbed the girl. Years of training to restrain aggressive patients came in handy. I turned her back to my front, took her right wrist in my left hand and vice versa, and crossed her arms. She slammed her head back into my chest, but I tightened my grip. Normally, I'd pivot and draw her backwards off her center of gravity or take her to the floor. However, neither of those options would get the girl into the salt circle around the chair. In the short distance to the recliner, Christina Hayes had used Jolene's body to kick the living hell out of my shins and headbutt my boobs black and blue. Close it, I called to Bryson through gritted teeth. Close the circle. The girl flailed against me, but I refused to let her go. I'd heal, but we had a chance to separate the spirit from Jolene. Lord knew when we'd have another shot. Bryson chanted, though I couldn't hear the words over the wailing ghost. His magic filled the room, and my spirit animal sat up and took notice. Focusing on keeping the flaming bird's heat on lockdown while holding a thrashing child required my full attention. It's no wonder I failed to notice Aaron approach in the chair until his arm crossed my line of vision. He placed his hands over mine and nodded, signaling for me to allow him to take over. I released Jolene and scrambled to the side to allow him room. He moved like a ninja, wrapping his arms and one leg around the girl, immobilizing her far better than I had. No surprise, police officers received a heck of a lot more training than I had in managing dangerous suspects. "Let me go." The voice coming out of Jolene's mouth quivered. Each time I'd interacted with the spirit, the girl was downright hostile. But something had changed. Was it because Aaron was larger and stronger than me? Or was there more to it? "Christina, we're going to help you move on." "Please, let me go. Please." Aaron spoke in low tones.
I'm sorry. I can't do that.
"You don't understand. I'm all she has. I've been with her since she was 2. I'm her only friend." I moved to the front of the chair. "Why Jolene? How is she connected to you?" The girl sagged in Aaron's arms. I glanced from Jolene's big blue eyes to Aaron's. I hadn't noticed they were the same color. Caribbean blue in the center, surrounded by a bluish-green ring with flecks of sapphire.
Tessa, move back.
Bryson sprinkled juniper around the circle and lit a bowl of foul-smelling herbs. "Wait!" My mind raced with the consequences of success and failure. How would Jolene react to us sending her only friend away? She loved Christina. If we failed, the spirit would know. We'd have no bite, nothing to control her with. Maybe we should ask Jolene what she wants. Bryson looked at me like I'd spoken in Swahili.
She will never live a life of her own with another person inside her, and Christina deserves peace.
You're right. I drew up my courage and my magic. We'd used the spell to banish ghosts many times. It was one of the first Bryson had taught me, and it had provided me relief from unwanted chatter from the other side. He nodded and began to chant.
Christina Hayes, it is time to go. I send you away to where you belong. Through paths not walked, with eyes not seeing, I send you away. Go now from me. Go to heaven and rest. This is said. This will be.
Christina gasped. "Please stop. You're ripping me in two." Bryson and I repeated the spell, but it felt wrong. My knees had turned to rubber and my hands shook, but more concerning was the sense that the spell was poisoning my soul. Christina was the ghost of a 15-year-old girl, not an evil conjurer. She'd done awful things to protect Jolene, but that didn't make her evil. My reaction to the magic made no sense.
Stop!
Aaron shifted Jolene in his arms. The girl had lost consciousness, but the spirit remained. Now that Bryson and I had started the spell, I could see the outline of Christina's energy around Jolene, whether she chose to manifest or not. Aaron placed the child on the floor and pressed his fingers to her neck.
Her pulse is thready.
I stood frozen in place. What have we done? Bryson went to his knees and listened to the girl's breaths. He sat back on his heels and hovered his hands over her forehead. Reaching out with his magic, he inched down her body to sense any injuries or signs of trouble.
Tessa, come closer. I need your energy.
I sank to the floor beside him. He took my hand, placed it over Jolene's heart, and set his on top.
You too, Aaron. Focus on sending her healing.
I closed my eyes and pushed tiny pulses of my magic into her body. A tickle on the back of my neck drew my attention. Christina's spirit stood to my right. "I tried to tell you. She needs me." You mean physically needs you? She nodded. The other ghosts feed from her energy. I keep them away.
Tessa, I need you to focus.
Bryson whispered. I promise I won't take over her body if you promise that he will not come near her again. Christina motioned to Aaron. He's keeping secrets. Dangerous ones.
I'm not keeping secrets.
The detective glared. Once again, he'd surprised me by seeing and hearing the dead. I know why you feel that way, but what happened to you wasn't his fault. He wouldn't hurt her. Bryson grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises.
We're losing her. Focus, both of you.
Christina put her face in front of mine. Can't you feel it? The others? I lifted my head and glanced around the room. She'd told the truth. Several entities hovered around the child. My throat tightened, squeezing off any hope I had of speaking. I jerked my hand away from Jolene and wheezed several breaths. There are others, eating her energy. Move away from her for a second. The guys eased back. Aaron's eyes widened.
What are those things?
Christina reached for him, but jerked her hand away when his amulet glowed. They're evil, just like you. I'll help her if you promise to stay away from her.
I promise.
He met Christina's gaze.
I promise. Just help her.
Why did you do that? My pulse beat against my eardrums. He looked back to the little girl on the floor.
I had to. What's happening?
Bryson glanced up. Ghosts. Several of them. Christina says they're feeding off Jolene. Aaron blinked a few times, shook his head and rubbed his eyes.
Where did they go? I can't feel them anymore.
Jolene drew a deep, shuddering breath.
Jojo, can you hear me?
Bryson leaned closer and repeated to magically scan the girl. She opened her eyes, graced us with a hint of a smile, and closed them again. Bryson rested his hands on his thighs and slumped his shoulders.
Thank God.
I touched Aaron's shoulder to get his attention. Why did you agree to stay away from her? She wouldn't have let Jolene die. He pressed his lips together. I reached for him, but he pulled back. We'll figure this out. I swear it. Aaron stood.
Once we find the killer, Christina will be at peace. Until then, I'll do what she wants.
I turned to Bryson. Do you agree with this?
No. But until I can figure out what happened to Jojo, we have no other choice.
Chapter 22. Amy Keller's mother clung to me like the girl from Titanic clung to that floating door. She had yet to cry, but it wouldn't be long. Her shoulders shook, and she breathed in short gasps punctuated by sighs. I'd held enough murder victims' mothers to read the signs. 11 years had passed since her child had disappeared on her way home from school. Time hadn't healed the parents' grief. If anything, the kernel of hope they carried that their daughter would return to them made it worse. Much worse.
I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Keller.
Samuels maintained a stoic tone, but the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes betrayed his emotions. The woman murmured, "You said you found Amy's necklace? It was a gift for her first communion. May I have it?" I eased from her grasp. "I'll make sure it's returned to you as soon as possible."
When can we bury our daughter?
Mr. Keller, who had remained quiet throughout the ordeal, moved to his wife's side. Samuels informed them of procedures and what to expect in the coming days, but I tuned him out. my thoughts drifted to another blonde-haired little girl, the one I hoped to save. Jolene had woken starving and angry. Though she refused to share her thoughts with us, she made it crystal clear that she did not want us to separate her from Christina. Likewise, Aaron, also angry, had made it crystal clear he intended to stay away from the house. It came as no surprise that he hadn't accompanied Samuels and me to speak to the grieving parents. The entire situation left me unstable, like building a house on quicksand. I'd left Jolene with Bryson hours ago and went to work. Try as I might, I couldn't focus on my job. Instead, I found myself fretting over what she ate for lunch, if she'd forgiven us, and our meeting with the school counselor later that afternoon. Samuel stood and shook Mr. Keller's hand.
If you have any questions, you can call the station or contact Miss Lamar. She's easier to reach than Detective Burns and myself.
Operating on autopilot, I offered the father my business card, my assistance with victims' compensation paperwork, and my condolences. My heart wasn't in it, but I'd run through the speech enough times that my tongue had developed muscle memory. Samuels remained quiet until we buckled up and pulled out of the Keller's driveway.
Where were you in there?
My shoulders sagged. I knew I'd phoned it in, but thought I'd covered the basics. This case is bothering me. He lowered his voice.
Case. Or cases.
Is it officially a serial killer? Did the DNA match? Samuels gave me a side eye.
You've been at this too long to fall victim to the CSI effect.
With the popularity of police dramas on television, the public had developed unrealistic ideas on how crime scene investigations were handled. Unfortunately, the public included jury members, lawyers, and sometimes judges. I've done no such thing. Do you have a solid link between the cases? His grip tightened on the steering wheel.
Same M.O., same dumping ground. It's only a matter of time before the lab tells us what we already know.
Forensic technology had come a long way since Samuels joined the force. He believed rookies' reliance on lab reports prevented them from developing cop instincts. I had to admit, Samuel's gut worked much faster and was just as accurate as any lab. Any idea how long the other bodies were out there? The thought of so many young girls murdered and buried so close to home gave me the willies.
I guess Amy Keller was the first he buried in the field. This guy's been at it a long time. He lived nearby, moved, and has returned. I'd also bet that wherever he went is missing blonde-haired little girls.
I nodded, not trusting my voice to hold or my brain to formulate an intelligent sentence.
What else is going on?
He stopped for a red light.
And don't tell me work. Burns has been off his game since the night in the field.
Did he tell you he took me to the Wagner scene? Samuels pressed his lips into a line and hit the gas.
No, but I'm not surprised. Did you get anything?
Not enough. I'd like to go back to the trailer, see if I can pick up any visions. The night we were there, I had an issue with a ghost.
Issue?
Let's just say Mr. Wagner's as nasty in the hereafter as he was in life. Samuels cracked a grin. Likely whatever had lightened his mood had to do with me humiliating myself in some way. He's dangerous. The trailer's a rental. It's only a matter of time before someone else moves in there.
Dangerous? How?
I ran my hands over my arms. He pushed me and Aaron around.
Like the other night in the field?
Yep, though the spirit in the field was stronger than anything I've encountered. The bruises covering my chest proved it. Christina Hayes was not to be trifled with. But she was a child. If Wagner had half her power, His size alone would make him deadly. He cut the wheel and turned into the station.
Sorry, no can do. You're not cleared to be on the scene. Frankly, I'm surprised Burns took you there. He's playing it by the book these days.
The promotion means a lot to him. I unbuckled my seatbelt, but didn't reach for the door. I had questions for Samuels. How bad did I screw him up the other night? He shrugged, but avoided my eyes.
Chief bought the story about hypoglycemia, ordered him to have a physical.
That's good, I guess. I shifted to face him. It's really important I get into that trailer. I think there's a connection between the Wagner murders and the serial killer. He turned his head fast enough to give him whiplash.
What aren't you telling me, Lamar?
I had his attention, but I needed to proceed with caution. The daughter, Jolene Parks. She looks a heck of a lot like the other victims. Samuels squared his jaw and gave me the full weight of his cop stare.
And
She's a medium. She's being haunted by one of the serial killer's victims, the same one who attacked Aaron at the scene. His eyes darkened.
You know this how?
Careful, Tessa. Don't say too much. Remember my friend Haley?
Yes.
She's the girl's therapist. She asked me to consult on the case. A flash of understanding crossed his expression.
Does Aaron know this?
Yes, which is why I'm talking to you about getting back on the scene and not him. I know it's a conflict of interest, but I'm telling you, there's a connection between Jolene Parks and Christina Hayes. The color drained from his face. I'd obviously hit a nerve.
Hayes? Tell me you aren't referring to Burns' cold case.
One and the same.
Is he aware of this?
Yes, sir. We found out at the same time. Between being stabbed with a fork and Christina Hayes speaking to him, he didn't take it well.
That explains why he's been off his game.
Samuels ran his hand over his face.
Wait, stabbed with a fork?
We were finishing up dinner. As soon as the words came out, I wished I could swallow them back down. His expression went from concern to surprise in the blink of an eye.
Why were you and Burns having dinner with Jolene Parks?
Crap. Double crap on toast. No sense in lying now. I'd said too much. Besides, Samuels was a living, breathing polygraph machine. My Aunt Dottie is fostering the girl. He held up both hands.
Stop. Don't say another word. I cannot know this.
She's not a suspect. Aaron said she'd been cleared. He closed his eyes and stilled as if counting to 10. When he opened them, he leveled me with his gaze.
Right. But this kind of thing sinks careers. Aaron needs to ask to be removed from the case.
Since Christina Hayes had effectively removed him from mine and Bryson's house, I absolutely hated the idea of him leaving the investigation. Not to mention, solving a case of this magnitude could clinch his promotion.
I'll talk to him.
Samuel sounded as if he'd aged 20 years in the course of our conversation. I don't suppose you'd keep my asking to get into Wagner's trailer to yourself? The corners of his eyes crinkled. A half-second later, he barked out a laugh.
I'll consider it.
Chapter 23. I walked through the front door with Samuel's words still bouncing around in my head. Not only had I failed to finagle a way back into Jolene's trailer, I'd spilled the beans on the girl's living arrangement. I hated to think about how Aaron would react to my latest screw-up. Bryson? I dropped my purse by the front door and wandered into the kitchen. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Hello? Anyone home? A quick glance at the clock sent my pulse racing. We had a half hour to reach a school 20 minutes away. While I had my doubts about sending Jolene back to class with an angsty teenaged ghost lying in wait to wreak havoc, I had no choice, what with the compulsory attendance laws and all. Bryson's voice caught my attention. I glanced out the window to find him standing in the yard with my Aunt Dottie and Jolene, all three dressed like they were going to church. I grabbed my purse and hurried outside. "Sorry I'm late. Everyone ready?" Holding Bryson's hand, Jolene looked between him and Dottie as if hoping one of them would save her from some unseen horror. She hadn't seemed this worried after the ghost of Christina Hayes stabbed Aaron with a fork. The adults offered reassuring smiles, but the girl's face was downright crestfallen. Kneeling in front of her, I asked, "Are you nervous about going back to school?" She shrugged. Not exactly a helpful or meaningful response. "Don't you miss your friends?" She averted her eyes, shook her head, and made a 0 with her hand. "Oh." I sucked in a breath. 4th grade was tough. 4th grade without friends was downright torture. "Let's go talk to the guidance counselor. See what she has to say." Jolene wiped her nose on the back of her hand, squared her shoulders, and marched to Bryson's SUV. Dottie shot me a worried look. I wonder if we could get a medical excuse from Dr. Alexander if she's not ready to go back. Maybe, but we should prepare her to return just in case. Bryson closed our doors and slid into the driver's seat. He hadn't said a word since I'd come home. I began to wonder if there was more going on than Jolene's school situation. He put the SUV in drive and took my hand, but he kept a steady eye on the girl in the back seat. I tried to force the stress from my voice, but my words came out peppy, bordering on manic. "How'd it go today?"
Good. We spent several hours in the studio. I'm teaching Jolene the basics of sculpting.
My fingers tensed hard enough that he wiggled my hand to loosen my grip. I didn't trust Christina's promise not to possess Jolene again. She'd done it too often to resist a little more skin time. Memories of Aaron with a fork sticking out of his thigh flashed through my mind. I'd intended to keep the girl away from sharp objects. Never did I imagine Bryson would hand her sculpting tools.
She has a knack for the pottery wheel.
He glanced in the rear view.
But we were both covered in mud when she finished.
I sagged a little. Pottery wheel. Thank heavens. Dottie said, "Don't forget, tap class is tomorrow afternoon, and May invited Darlene and Stone for dinner." "I have it on my calendar." I smiled, though I'd lied through my teeth. I'd totally forgotten. I should be able to take her.
If not, I can handle it.
Bryson turned into the elementary school parking lot. Jolene climbed out of the SUV and stared up at the building with a resigned expression. "Ready?" I offered my hand, but she nodded and pulled her little pink jacket tighter around herself. I knew better than to promise everything would be okay. I had no control over what went on in her classroom. "I know you're worried, but whatever happens, we'll be there for you when you get home." She stared with her big blue eyes, and I wanted to put her right back in the SUV, drive away, and never look back. I'd quit my job and homeschool her if it meant she'd never look at me like I was marching her before a firing squad again. School hadn't changed much since I was a kid. They still smelled like glue and cleaning supplies. The floors still gleamed. The walls still held posters and finger paint art. And they still set my nerves on edge. Dottie Nokaseka and Jolene Parks were here to see Mrs. Clark. My aunt spoke to the woman behind the counter while Bryson, Jolene, and I loitered near the door. The color drained from her face. "Oh, Yes, of course. I'll bus her. Please have a seat. Jolene pressed herself into Bryson's side. Judging from the disapproving looks from the woman behind the counter, she knew the girl, or at least her reputation. This was a huge mistake. Mrs. Clark didn't look like any elementary school counselor I'd ever met. I guessed she was a couple of years younger than me, with pretty brown eyes and long dark hair. She wore Converse sneakers, jeans, and a t-shirt with the school logo. She also wore the same march me before a firing squad expression as Jolene. Mrs. Nogaseka, I'm Mary Clark. She held her hand out to me, but her gaze shifted to Bryson and Jolene. Dottie smiled. I'm Mrs. Nogaseka. This is my grandniece, Tessa Lamar, and her fiancé, Bryson DeClay. They're helping me out with fostering. I see. She shook my aunt's hand. I'd like to speak with you before we bring Jolene in. The tone of her voice set my jaw on edge. She was about to tell Dottie something she didn't want to hear. Bryson can sit with Jolene while we talk. Mrs. Clark nodded and turned for the hallway. Follow me, please. Nudging my side, Dottie whispered, Thank you. Inside the guidance counselor's office, my aunt and I sat in hard plastic chairs, too short for adults but likely too large for little kids. They gave me the impression the school had tried to find a middle ground and failed. I had a feeling this meeting would end with the same result. Mary Clark sank into her chair and opened a thick folder. She looked over the first page, though I'd bet my right arm she knew exactly what it said. I think it's amazing that you and your family are foster parents. You have my utmost respect. But the word hung in the air like the smell of burnt popcorn. Are you familiar with Jolene's, history? She glanced between us. Dottie motioned for me to answer. Her recent family history, yes. There wasn't much else in her mental health records. The psychosocial evaluation was done with the help of the next-door neighbor. I resisted the urge to throw my professional credentials around. I was curious to see where this conversation was headed. She was placed in a special needs kindergarten class, diagnosed with attention deficit disorder in 2nd grade, and homeschooled in 3rd grade. We're her 6th school. She was with us 3 months before the incident. I sat back in my chair. Why were her academic records not sent to the group home or her therapist? Mrs. Clark sighed, long and deep. Likely, the request is sitting in a box, waiting to be completed. We're miserably underfunded and understaffed. Which brings me to my next point. Dottie stiffened her spine. We're a public school. We can't turn her away, but we can't give Jolene the help she needs to succeed here. She closed the file, as if her words had closed the matter. I'm not disagreeing with you, but her social worker made it quite clear that we had to get the girl back into school. I wanted to believe Mrs. Clark had the child's best interest at heart. I really did. But I couldn't shake the feeling there was more to it than she'd let on. What are we supposed to do? It's my understanding Jolene has won scholarships from her pageants. Is it possible to use some of that money to pay for a private school? She smiled. Too sweet for my tastes. No, they're college scholarships. I mirrored her saccharine expression. Dottie patted my hand. I'll call the social worker and see what we can do. We've taken up enough of your time, Mrs. Clark. While I had no intention of sending Jolene to this school, I intended to get as much out of Mary Clark as I could. You said you can't turn her away, but you obviously don't want her here. I'd like to know what you aren't telling us, and I'd like a copy of her records. She bristled. I never said she wasn't welcome. And I'd be happy to release her records with the proper consent from her legal guardian. A release that'll sit in an inbox for the next however long? I reached into my purse and retrieved my business card wallet. Not that my mental health credentials would impress her, but the card with the logo of the Orange County Police Department tended to make people sit up straighter. I'd like to speak to you in a professional capacity, as Miss Park's therapist. She eyed the card, opened a drawer, and pulled out a stack of papers. This is an application for a state-funded scholarship program for kids with special needs. Mrs. Nokosika and the social workers can apply on Jolene's behalf. It's a quick process, and once awarded, it pays for private school tuition, fees, and books. I'd be happy to provide the documentation you'll need to complete the application along with the rest of her records, but I'll need a signed release. Thank you. Dottie thumbed through the paperwork. Yes, thank you. I nodded. Could you recommend a school for her? Mrs. Clark paled again. I'd reached my limit. The woman could have led with the scholarship application, but she'd seemed resistant since we'd sat down. I had a sinking feeling I knew why. What did she say to you? Who? Her eyes widened. I softened my smile in hopes of disarming her. Jolene. She's given me more than a few scares. I'd like to know what she said to you that has you so on edge. Mrs. Clark glanced between me and my aunt. Dottie caught on quick. Me too. Messages from my husband who passed last year. I cringed at the notion Charlie chose to speak to the girl instead of me. However, my reaction seemed to convince Mrs. Mary Clark we were all in the same pickle. She told me where to find my wedding ring. I lost it right after my dad's funeral. Tears fell down her cheeks, but if she noticed, she made no move to wipe them away. I knew from first-hand experience newly bereft people didn't always know they were crying. It was like the grief liquefied and took on a life of its own. I'm sorry for your loss, but I honestly believe Jolene thinks she's trying to help. The woman snatched a tissue from the box and dabbed her face. There's more. A girl in Jolene's class was seriously injured. I braced myself for another story involving flatware. Jolene brought one of her pageant crowns to show and tell. It broke while the children were passing it around. She paused, glanced at us, and sighed. The little girl who was injured is the one who broke the crown. The other students said she did it on purpose. When the teacher asked the girl to bring her the pieces, the girl tripped and fell. She lost an eye. Dottie pressed her hand to her mouth. My stomach threatened to expel my lunch, but I continued. Did Jolene trip her? No. This is off the record. Please. Okay. I glanced at Dottie. My aunt leaned forward and lowered her voice. We only want to help her. Anything you can tell us will be kept between the three of us. The teacher told me in confidence that it looked like something picked Michaela up and slammed her to the ground. She shook her head, as if to get the image out of her mind. I know it sounds crazy, but there have been many similar but smaller incidents. Dropped lunch trays, pants falling down, childish pranks, but they always seem to happen to the kids who pick on Jolene Parks. Christina freaking Hayes was ruining this little girl's life. Maybe they should stop picking on her? Dottie surprised me with her stern tone. Or maybe the teachers should keep a better eye on the bullies. Normally, I'd agree, but the students and the teachers are afraid of her. Mrs. Clark's shoulders fell. Look, she's a sweet little girl, but she's developed quite the reputation. Now, with the news coverage of her parents' murders, I'm afraid the bullying and fear will only get worse. Chapter 24. Contrary to popular belief, a mental health counselor isn't there to give advice. Mostly, their job is to shut up and listen. In grad school, the professors taught us to get comfortable with silence. I'd once sat in a room with a client for 5 whole minutes waiting for her to speak. However, the silence in the SUV on the way to Dr. Alexander's office from the school ate my patience like a dog with a bacon-wrapped beef tenderloin. Bryson had questions. Dottie had questions. Heck, I had questions. But we couldn't exactly talk in front of Jolene. Not with a hormonal ghost lying in wait to turn the little girl into a lunatic. Lunatics and cars were a lethal combination. It's a good thing Dr. Alexander can see you today. Dottie patted Jolene's leg. He's a friend of mine. A real nice man. I turned to the back seat. Do you remember meeting him in the hospital? Chewing her bottom lip, Jolene pulled out her notebook from her pocket and wrote, Am I in trouble? Oh, this poor child. She made my heart hurt. Not at all. We're looking into some different schools. You were right. I didn't much care for the elementary school either. She nodded and looked out the window. Bryson gave me a sideways glance and tightened his grip on the wheel. I smiled, trying to convey everything would be okay, we'd talk later, and I loved him, all with my expression. Somehow he got the message, because he took my hand and kissed it. Bryson parked and we marched into the office building with the same sense of foreboding we'd had at the school. Or at least, I had a sense of foreboding. I couldn't shake the feeling that our time with Jolene would be like playing a game of sorry. Just when we'd start to get ahead, we'd land on the wrong square and slide back to the beginning. Haley's father stood at the reception desk when we walked into the lobby. His salt and pepper hair, along with his Mr. Rogers cardigan, made me think back to the stories Haley had told me about growing up with a psychiatrist for a father.
Jolene, good to see you again.
He knelt to her eye level.
Would you like to talk to me now or after the adults?
The pain in my sternum surprised me. I'd never had a dad. During the times I'd lived with Dottie and Charlie, he'd filled the role and did it well. But somehow, it wasn't quite the same thing. The familiar ache reminded me that somewhere out there was a man who'd created me and didn't want me. Jolene wrote her answer. Dr. Alexander stood.
All right, then. I'll see the grown-ups first.
Dottie and I shared a glance.
Hey, Jojo. They have chess.
Bryson motioned for Jolene to join him at a miniature table. She flashed him a crocodile smile, or more like a shark smile. I had a feeling Bryson would go down hard.
Right this way, ladies.
Dr. Alexander motioned to his office. My aunt and I seated ourselves on his comfy couch.
Thank you for calling, Dottie. I'm happy I could get you in so quick. Tell me again what happened with the counselor.
The doctor's expression confused me. His grin touched his eyes, but instead of softening them, they almost smoldered. Unlike the meeting with the counselor, Dottie took the lead with Dr. Alexander. Between the way he looked at my aunt and the lift in her voice, I was convinced the two had a thing for each other. I refused to allow my brain to imagine the possibilities of them dating. Talk about conflicts of interest. After hearing a replay of our meeting, minus the paranormal bits, Dr. Alexander leaned forward and stapled his fingers under his chin.
Tessa, do you have anything to add?
I hesitated to tell him about the spirit haunting Jolene. He hadn't taken it well when the news media outed me as a psychic working for the Orange County Police Department. Like his daughter, he believed in all things rational and backed by evidence. No, sir.
How do you feel about virtual school?
I took a handful of online classes in college, but Jolene's in 4th grade. How would that work? He stood, opened the second drawer of his file cabinet, and handed me a brochure.
Students have an assigned teacher who grades their work and offers assistance, but the classes are taken online at home. Parents or other adults act as learning coaches. The level of involvement from the coaches is based on student needs, attention spans, etc. I won't kid you. The parents I know who use the program spend 4 to 6 hours a day educating their children.
An image of my unfinished paperwork flashed unwelcome through my head. It could work, I guess. Dottie nodded. Between you, me, and Bryson, I think we could handle 4th grade, but it's probably best to leave May out of it. I couldn't agree more. I loved my great-grandmother, but she still struggled with the TV remote. Grandma on a computer would guarantee weekly visits from the Geek Squad.
The concept is still relatively new for younger students. There aren't a lot of studies that show the impact on the children's peer-to-peer relationships and social skills, but in cases like Jolene's, the benefits of a low-stress educational environment outweigh the potential risks.
I scanned the brochure. We're planning to continue her dance and voice lessons. Pageants are a big part of her life. And I'll look into joining some playgroups.
All good ideas. But I don't have to tell you, the best thing you can do for Jolene is to follow her lead. She'll let you know what she can handle.
He turned to Dottie.
Do you need some time to look at the program, or shall I call her social worker with my recommendations?
Not orders? I'd hoped his word would be all we needed to proceed.
They may balk, but all of us want what's best for the child. I'll speak to Mrs. White personally. It shouldn't be a problem.
He turned to Dottie.
You did a fine job raising Tessa. Trust your instincts. And please, feel free to call me if you have any questions.
Thank you, Malcolm. I think we should put her in computer school as soon as possible. She squared her shoulders. Malcolm? Sure, they were friends, but it bothered me to hear her call him by his first name.
Do either of you have any other questions?
Dottie shook her head. I wanted to question his intentions with my aunt, but thought the better of it. None here. Want me to send Jolene back?
Please, and schedule a follow-up in 2 weeks before you go.
Will do. Dottie, Bryson, and I watched Jolene walk into the psychiatrist's office, waited for the door to close, and all started talking at once. As if choreographed, we stopped talking, waited, then started again. I covered my mouth to prevent a fit of stress-induced giggles while Dottie filled Bryson in on the conversations with the school counselor and Dr. Alexander. At the mention of virtual school, Bryson perked up.
4th grade online?
I slipped the brochure into his hand. Yep, but she needs an adult learning coach.
I'll do it.
He studied the Florida virtual school pamphlet like a preacher studying notes for a sermon.
This is amazing.
I leaned in to read the brochure. I wish they'd had this when I was in school. Dottie stared at the two of us with a knowing smile. Self-conscious, I eased away from Bryson. What's that look for? Oh, nothing. She smoothed her slacks over her thighs. But if I was thinking something, I'd say the two of you are going to make terrific parents. I wouldn't have thought it possible, but between Bryson's grin and the warmth in my chest, I believed her. Chapter 25. Sitting in the lobby with visions of baby booties and tiny clothes dancing through my head, I failed to notice Jolene had returned until she curled up next to Bryson. Dr. Alexander cleared his throat.
Tessa, may I speak to you a moment?
The girl sniffled. Torn between finding out what the heck had happened and consoling Jolene, I ran my hand down her back, kissed her head, and whispered, "I'll be right back, okay?" She nodded. Bryson motioned to the hall before turning his attention to the girl. Dottie stood to accompany me. The doctor opened his mouth as if to protest, but sighed and walked toward his office. Once inside, Malcolm Alexander paced the room. I'd never seen the man so agitated. Sitting in the chair brought back memories of my childhood. Memories of other therapists, teachers, and a couple of pastors who I'd freaked out by giving them messages from their dearly departed.
I don't know where to begin.
He ran his hand over his head, causing his hair to stand at off angles.
My wife, Haley's mother.
She told you something only your wife could know, didn't she? I tried to keep my voice steady. Jolene had done something that shook this man's core beliefs. I knew the drill. Psychiatrist or not, he'd freak out now. But in a couple of hours, he'd rationalize the entire event. Chalk it up to grief or coincidence. He might get angry, or, more likely, stoic. No matter how Dr. A ended up dealing with his brush with the dead, things would be difficult for Jolene, and likely me.
Yes.
He turned and stared until I squirmed. Dottie stood and rested her hand on his forearm. This has to be difficult for you. I know you don't believe in the afterlife, but that little girl has a gift. He turned toward her and searched her eyes. If I had any doubt there was something going on between these two, it evaporated when she smoothed his rumpled hair. I'd never seen my aunt look at any other man besides Charlie. To witness it less than a year after his death split me right down the middle. Part of me felt betrayed for him, but the other part wanted her to find love again. Dr. Alexander glanced at me.
Tessa, the work you do with the OCPD, it's real?
Yes, I'm a real live victims advocate. My words came out snarkier than I'd intended. Maybe I wasn't split down the middle. Maybe I was 80-20 on the side of feeling betrayed for Charlie. Dottie stepped back and dipped her chin. He seemed to realize they'd shared a private moment in a not-so-private setting and straightened his sweater.
I was referring to the psychic work.
Yes, it's real. And whatever Jolene told you is real, too. I motioned to nothing and everything. That guidance counselor? She said the students and teachers were afraid of Jolene. Your own employees refused to treat her because she passed on messages from their dearly departed. That little girl out there needs our help, and I'm not going to let you—
Tessa Marie.
Dottie shot me a hard look. Dr. Alexander stared as if I'd sprouted wings and a tail.
No, it's okay. Let her speak her mind.
I softened my approach for my aunt's sake. I'm aware that I'm transferring my experiences onto you, and I apologize. But you have to understand, I've walked in the same shoes as Jolene. I know what it's like to have something happening to you that people either don't believe or are afraid of. He dropped into his desk chair and leaned it back until I thought he might tumble ass over tea kettle.
I apologize, ladies, but I need some time to process all of this. Thank you for your candor, Tessa. Dottie, I'll call on you this evening.
Dottie and I left Malcolm Alexander's office in silence. A silence that continued for the entire drive home. Bryson cast worried glances in the rearview mirror and at me, but he remained blessedly quiet. I owed her a huge apology. She was a grown woman, a widow, who deserved any chance at happiness she could get. I just could not get my brain around how her dating someone else would work with Charlie's ghost hanging around the house. She'd obviously spent time with Dr. Alexander, telephone conversations and such. Did it bother her to know her husband might be watching? Had they talked about it in one of his spectral visits? I'd wrapped myself up in my thoughts so tight I didn't realize we were home until Bryson's Land Rover bounced up the drive. I caught sight of Graham May sitting on the porch swing when we parked. Her lips moved like she was talking, but I didn't see anyone else around. That is, until we got out of the SUV and my cousin TJ sprang out of the bushes, hands up, roaring like a wild man. Jolene yelped. I jumped, and Bryson laughed. Dottie pressed her hand over her heart. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, I got you. I got y'all good. TJ pumped his fist in the air and took a victory lap around us. I was not in the mood. Tank dropped him off about an hour ago. He's going to be staying with us weekdays till after dinner while his daddy works. Graham May might have smiled, but I could tell by her raised chin and hands on her hips she wasn't exactly happy about the situation. TJ folded his arms and huffed. My mama ran off with some guy she met at the bar, said she needed time to find herself. I resisted the urge to facepalm. At times like these, I wondered if anyone in my family had a lick of sense when it came to raising kids. Bryson shot me an "is he serious" look.
Sorry to hear that.
The boy gave Jolene a once-over, wrinkled his nose, and pointed. Who's that girl? Her name is Jolene. She's staying with us now. Unlike my half-wit cousins, I didn't plan to get into the hows and whys of adult business with a child. Like, forever? TJ's expression went from sour to curious. Jolene glanced from me to Bryson. Her eyes, so full of questions and hope they stole my breath. Forever wasn't part of the plan. Or was it? Forever's a long time. Besides, all kids leave home when they grow up. I tried for diplomacy. TJ rolled his eyes. That ain't true. Kelvin's still living with his mama, and he's old, real old, like 30. The kid had a point. My second cousin had yet to leave the nest, despite several attempts to force him to fly. Grandma clapped her hands. I need to get dinner started. You young'uns go play, but stay out of my garden. He cocked his head to the side and crossed his arms. How old are you? Jolene, who'd hung close to Bryson since we'd arrived, froze in place. The color had drained from her face, and her eyes looked as if they'd pop out of her head. What's wrong with her? Is she stupid or something? TJ walked closer to the girl.
Men don't insult women.
Bryson set his hand on her shoulder.
She's quiet.
The boy's cheeks turned rosy. I'm sorry, but how old is she anyway? 5? She's 9. The interaction between the children intrigued me. Besides the ghost, this was the first time I'd seen her around another child. 9. The boy nodded, as if appreciating a fine bottle of wine. Jolene stared, as if listening to someone, nodded, and pulled her notebook from her pocket. What's she doing? TJ had lost some of his bravado. The guidance counselor's words rang in my ear. Kids who picked on Jolene had accidents. I stepped closer just in case Christina made an appearance. She's writing you a note. She don't talk. Bryson said,
She'll talk when she has something important to say.
I fell a little deeper in love. Only he could explain the girl's silence in such a lovely way. Jolene handed TJ the note. He stared at it, frowned, and handed it to me. Can't read yet. I'm only in kindergarten. I glanced at the paper. She says, it's okay. Want to draw? The boy glanced at the adults, around the yard, and finally to Jolene. We can draw. Then I'll teach you to use a BB gun. I thought I might pass out. The last thing we needed was Christina's spirit locked and loaded. Bryson saved me from poo-pooing the idea.
Only with an adult present.
TJ toed the ground. I know. Dottie's cell phone rang and she walked away from the noise to take the call. I'll have supper ready in about an hour. Grandma hurried across the lawn, likely grateful to escape kid duty. The rest of us trudged into Charlie's house. While Bryson set the kids up with crayons and colored pencils, I waited for Dottie to finish her call and come inside. My aunt walked through the door with a stunned expression. I pulled her into the kitchen. What's wrong? That was Mrs. White. The paternity test results. The man on, she nodded toward the kids, isn't her daddy. Oh my goodness. What does that mean for her? What happens now? Wide-eyed, she shook her head. She has no one. She has us. I hadn't given much thought to the mysterious soldier named on Jolene's birth certificate. He hadn't taken the time to be a father before her mother died. Why would he now? However, knowing that she had no family to claim her made it easier for us to keep her. Dottie embraced me. Of course she does. I'm sorry I behaved so awfully back there. You and Dr. A took me by surprise. I kept my voice down. The kid could spread gossip faster than a room full of church ladies. I should have mentioned it, but it's new. Then Jolene came and I assumed we'd just be friends. It's not appropriate for him to make time with his patient's foster parent. I stifled a giggle. Dottie, making time means hitting on someone. You know, physical advances. Her cheeks burned bright red. In my day, it meant to court someone. TJ's voice carried from the living room, reminding us we weren't alone. Dottie leaned close, her hand on my arm and worry in her voice. Those things Mrs. Clark said. Is TJ okay around her? My lie of omission had come back and taken a supersized bite out of my rear end. I'm sorry. I should have told you and Grandma sooner. Jolene's haunted by a teenaged ghost. It's causing all the trouble, not her. Bryson and I will take care of it. Until then, I'll keep an eye on the kids. She nodded, but I'd caught the slight pursing of her lips. I was going to be in trouble when she spoke to me. That's not funny. It's not nice to tease people smaller than you, TJ shrieked. She says your bunny is under the seat in the truck. Jolene's voice, and I was 100% sure it was her and not the spirit, surprised the ever-loving crap out of me. I don't have no stuffed bunny and my granny is dead. Yes, you do. She says you can't sleep without it. That's a lie, and you're a freak, Jolene Trailer Parks. Dottie and I rounded the corner in time to witness Jolene punch TJ square in the nose. TJ's wails filled the house. Bryson emerged from the hall.
Did she just...
I took a step back to keep my balance. She spoke. Chapter 26. Bryson and I sat at the kitchen table facing Jolene. We hadn't done it on purpose, but we were presenting a united front. Although, to Jolene, it might have come across as separating ourselves from her. I honestly had no clue how to proceed. If I should sit beside her, if I should reprimand her, if I should mention the fact she'd uttered her first words in weeks. Jolene stared at the table with her hands clasped in her lap. She'd tried to apologize to TJ, but the boy begged for Dottie to take him to Grandma's.
That wasn't Christina who hit TJ, was it?
Bryson leaned forward. No, sir. She glanced between us.
You're 9 years old. That's old enough to know it isn't okay to hit someone.
The girl's shoulders curled forward.
But since you're just learning the rules of this house, it doesn't seem right to punish you. We don't use fists to settle arguments. If someone hurts your feelings, you either use your words or you find an adult.
He glanced at me as if seeking approval. I nodded, though I couldn't wait to get him alone and tell him what a great job he was doing with her. He'd surprised me on every turn. Bryson slid his hand across the table and turned his palm up.
Does that sound fair?
She placed her hand in his. Yes. He glanced in my direction, then back to the girl.
It's good to hear your words.
I had to talk because TJ can't read. She shrugged. I figure, since I started, I might as well keep going. Plus, I like it here. My breath caught. I had no idea what had changed to make her comfortable enough with us to speak, but I swore I'd never get tired of listening to the sound of her voice. And we like having you here. Can you tell us what happened between you and TJ? Ruth? Darlene's mother, Ruth, had died when I was around TJ's age. I barely remembered her face, except for the pictures Grandma kept on her dresser. She's TJ's great-grandmother. She asked me to tell him his bunny was under the seat in his dad's truck. Jolene glanced between me and Bryson. It's true. I swear it. I moved to the chair beside her. We believe you. It must be frustrating when people think you're lying and call you names. She dipped her chin. I hate it. Bryson squeezed her hand.
Jojo, it's not your fault. People are afraid of what they don't understand.
She shrugged. Were you afraid of the dark when you were little? I asked. No, because the ghosts lit up my room. I resisted the urge to gawk. I'd seen my fair share of glowing spirits as a child, but never enough to chase away the darkness. I'm afraid of the man in the blue car. Her voice cracked. Bryson and I exchanged a look. He said,
Have you seen him?
She shook her head and wrapped her arms around herself. The girls told me about him. They say he's close. A million thoughts ran through my head. How close? Was he watching her? Was she in danger? Could I speak to the girls? Could we find him before he hurt another child?
Jojo, look at me.
Bryson set his elbows on the table. She lifted her head.
Tessa and I are going to keep you safe. Aaron, too.
He winked in my direction.
Do you know how I met Tessa?
She shook her head. I laughed, remembering how much he'd gotten on my nerves in the early days. He was my bodyguard. He kept me safe from some pretty bad people. Jolene glanced between us with wide eyes. It did? Bryson nodded.
She didn't like it much at first, but it was my job. And now it's my responsibility to look after you.
Jolene scrambled out of her chair and launched herself into Bryson's arms. Swallowing hard, he cradled her head against his shoulder. Our eyes met, and I knew he'd die before he let her down. Forever suddenly didn't seem like such a long time. He pulled back enough to see her face.
I'm starving. I bet May has dinner on the table. What do you say we go eat?
Jolene's eyes lit up. Chicken and dumplings?
I'm hoping for pot roast.
Bryson set the girl on her feet.
Let's go find out.
We walked down the path to Grandma May's, hand in hand. For the second time that day, I allowed myself to imagine what it would be like to have a baby, 2 husbands, and a little girl who won beauty pageants and talked to the dead. For the second time that day, reality threw cold water on my daydreams. We walked into a mess when we entered May's. TJ stood, huddled with his nose in the corner. Tank, the big bully, paced the kitchen while my great-grandmother looked on. I had no idea what had happened, but my great-grandmother seemed ready to break out a switch and strap his big redneck butt. As if the family drama in the kitchen weren't enough, Dottie covered the phone and mouthed, "Social worker." Judging by her expression and the way she held the phone 3 inches from her ear, the conversation wasn't going well. I turned to Bryson and silently pleaded for him to get us the heck out of there. All right. Yes, I understand. Dottie shook her head. I'll let you know as soon as I register her. She nodded. Yes, just this school year. She hung up the phone. What was that about? I crossed the kitchen to her side. Mrs. White isn't happy about it, but we have permission to send Jolene to virtual school. Dottie threw her arms around my neck. What in tarnation is virtual school? Grandma May put her hands on her hips.
It's school on the computer.
Bryson, still holding Jolene's hand, grinned like he'd won the lottery.
She'll have a real teacher, and I'm her learning coach.
You are? The girl's expression mirrored his. Grandma May placed her hand over her heart. My heavens, she's talking.
What do you think we've been arguing about?
Tank pointed at the girl.
She said some nonsense to TJ.
Now you wait a minute. I refused to stand there and argue in front of the children. We'd made too much progress with Jolene to let him ruin it. We can discuss this like adults, with only the adults. Tank gave me a look that would cower most men. Unfortunately for him, I'd grown up with him. His size and stank eye didn't intimidate me. Ask him why the boy's in the corner. Grandma May nodded to TJ, who'd turned around enough to watch the fireworks.
He let that weird little girl sock him in the nose and won't stop crying over a stuffed rabbit. That's why.
Tank glared, practically daring me to argue, which I planned to do. You and me, outside, now. I turned to march out the door when Bryson set his hand on my shoulder.
Let me handle this.
He turned his attention to Tank.
Go outside and look under the seat in your truck. What? Why?
My cousin glanced at Grandma May as if she'd know. Grandma May didn't say a word, and Bryson didn't budge.
You've all lost your GD minds. It ain't in the truck, and there weren't no message from the great beyond.
He stormed out the door. Good gracious. Grandma May shook her head. Tessa Marie, set the table. You kids go wash up for dinner and be sweet to each other. Yes, ma'am. Jolene and TJ replied in unison, shared a dirty look, and headed off to the bathroom. I pulled the plates from the cupboard while Bryson laid out the knives and forks. By the time Tank returned, we had everything on the table, including a glorious-smelling bowl of shrimp and grits. My cousin's eyes were a little watery, but I chose the high road and didn't mention it. He held a stuffed rabbit in one hand and his ball cap in the other.
I looked everywhere for this. I thought we'd lost it at the fair.
David Hasselhoff! TJ grabbed the rabbit and crushed it against his chest. A giggle bubbled up. I tried to hold it back, but I ended up snort laughing. David Hasselhoff? Tank smirked.
Lulu's favorite actor.
Still clinging to the rabbit, TJ said, I'm sorry I called you names, Jolene. The girl smiled as bright as the noonday sun. I'm sorry I punched you. Let's eat before it gets cold. Nothing worse than eating cold grits. Grandma wiggled her brows at Tank. Except eating crow.
This has been part 2 of The Spirit Child, Tessa Lamar novels, Book 3. Written by Kathryn M. Hearst. Narrated by Holly Adams. If you enjoyed this audiobook, please subscribe to Kathryn's channel where you can find part 3 of The Spirit Child, along with more of Kathryn's paranormal and contemporary romance novels.